first up, we're going to have one of our critical care paramedics, Jeff Andrew, and Raelene Hartman, who is the Chief Psychologist at New South Wales Ambulance. They're going to speak to us about significant events, the impacts and how we might manage these. So we'll welcome them up first. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to share.
Yeah. Happy with it. Do you want me to hit your slides for you, or are you all right to just...
I'll put that up.
You're right, sweet. Yeah, no worries.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for having me. Got Ab Singh as well, so we're on this case together. We're just going to do a bit of a review. And it's interesting, at a clinical education day, I tried to do a bad enough job last time that I wouldn't have got invited back, but here I am again, so I'll see if I can sort it out this time. But I think it fits quite well in a way, because I'm a big believer in the, when you're thriving, you get that flow effect, and, it's all about well-being. Really fits into our clinical performance as well. I think, when we're in that surviving mode, we usually probably underperform our benchmark. So, this does sit really well with myself, and I don't know if others would agree that, well-being is part of our, how we perform on a job in our clinical world as well. Quick chat about this. So we just going to go through a little bit of a case study, but I used the heading "A Day to Forget." Last time I had a chat, it was on any given week was my heading, and that was because, it can be a normal week for most people, but there's a few compounding effects, and you might hit a little bit of a lull, or, and sometimes it's that unknown case, you're not sure why, triggers some things that you need to work through. This time I'm sort of gone full circle. And it was an interesting lead-in, because after the last one, I was sitting with Abs at the desk, and we had our crew. And outside of Abs, I won't use names just for confidentiality, so I'll refer to people by their roles. But sitting there with the pilot and crewman, and we were chatting about the day, and Abs was really interested more in how the system was working, and it triggered some questions about how we do things, what's available in ambulance. And I something around the comment, and this would have always got us a big job, was, it's been a long time since I've really had that job that you just wouldn't want to go to, And I think for most of us, you would say, most jobs, everyone's going, oh, that'll be interesting, that'll be good. And, and we worry that we sound like, saddists or, but it's the fact that we want to perform and give this person their best opportunity at life on their worst day by us being there and performing the skills we train for, and it's part of our role. And then every so often we can all remember when phone goes off, the crew walk out the door, and you're like, thank God it's not me, that's just that job that you don't want to necessarily go to for whatever reasons. And the pilot, I said, oh, how's it going with, the services that they've got their own team of psychologists, etc. He goes, I haven't had a job for ages that's, really triggered that response. So that, the one time it did, a few years back, it went well. And so this was just set up that the next call was going to be that job. And so it went. And one of the, sort of feeding down a little bit, a discussion that I had a few days later triggered things around, and probably the second part of the heading is, normalising the abnormal, is that sort of sensory load and processing. And Louise was our psychologist at the time, and most people have heard she's gone on a secondment. And Raelene stepped in a place who'll have a chat today, and so I really was interested in rounding off some things that are normal responses for us, and some of the things, and the big statement, I believe, is some of the things that make you anxious is feeling, where's this leading me? Is this too long? Am I seeing too much? And so I think it's really important to know what's normal processing and be comfortable with that. And it took me back to probably a couple of years in the job. I was had my first time I went to court, and it would have been, I'm assuming it was a murder charge, and most times you write statements but don't go. On this time, I was at Balgowlah, it was down the Corso, and someone, we basically treated a cardiac arrest patient of unknown cause, and, there's a belt around his neck, some weird stuff. And anyway, never really thought much about it. There was nothing significant about the job. But I remember I went to court in Downing Street, and they asked you these questions, and I'm like, which way was the belt orientated? And I'm like, I can't remember what I had for breakfast. Like, why, to the best of my knowledge, we use all these fancy get out of jail-free cards, to try and work through the court session, just to say as little as you can, because it meant nothing to me 18 months later. And then it wasn't long after that I was working at Ride, and I had, about 18 months ago, but it was 18 years ago, sorry, that I had a phone call that was, something traumatic in the family that the police had been trying to get me. And that moment that was significant in my life, I can still remember. I could mark X where I was standing. I can still remember the handrail. I can remember paint chips out of it, and I can still remember that today. And it's not unhealthy for me because that's something that over time has changed, and and it doesn't have a negative impact on me, but it just frames that moment. And yet I can't remember the whole station really. I'd struggle to do the floor plan. But it's always made me think and I think of people who are in court and they've been a victim and they can describe something so well, and I'm like, why can they do that? And yet I turn up and I can't remember anything about the job. And I think it proves the fact that your brain, and I'll leave it to an expert to explain it to us better, but how we transcript things so firmly, where it has an impact on you compared to, where it's part of your daily job. So leading into that, I use the day to forget, because this was one of those jobs that, the way it led in, no one, it had a bit of impact on a lot of people there. So we'll just work through the case study, and then Ab's going to make a few statements. And without getting too much into detail, we just want to talk through some of our experiences of the job. And we actually had this discussion yesterday that we didn't want to know about each other's in a way, because there'll be a little human experiment as to what we saw. So, all right, I'll just move forward there. So just a brief thing about the tasking. So just getting that night shift where people are sort of working out where they're going with the night, whether they're settling down or getting active, and we got the call. So car in the tree, it was looking like there was possibly a deceased person on scene, early information. We had the Westpac helicopter also coming down from Belmont. In fact, they were probably first tasked. We were right in that middle zone up at Central Mangrove. And so first reports started coming in, and I apologised to Abs because I was like, we're probably just going to have to play this one as we see it, because it was such a mixed response, and when you can tell that the crew's on scene, it's that chaotic. The last thing they want to hear is, can we please get a mist, and all this sort of business. That's the one way to turn everyone off before you get there. So we know that getting that mist and that information is so important, but judgment on this job is, let's just be prepared for what we get, because there was so many patients. We had 6 in total, and we looked at 1 probably deceased, another 2 that we may be working on, and then still 3 other patients known that was in a car crash that caused that sort of carnage. So getting overhead, you could see all the action happening, and just as we're getting to that point, we get that next report that 2 children are now deceased and 1 adult. And then we've still got 3 patients to have a look at. So at that point, Westpac's come in and landed just before us. So we're tasked first a little bit closer, and we've gone, don't mind that time frame, I've put us as an hour 20 response. It was actually 20 minutes. I've just got my times wrong. But here's just the scene. So you've got everything happening, and that was a picture of the scene, but it was that classic walk through, and you're actually trying to, you need someone to orientate you to where everything's happening. And we've landed over at the golf course there behind the Westpac helicopter. And one of the things I do remember is, as we first got there, one of the crewmen from Westpac, we'd been chatting earlier in the night to one of the Newcastle guys, and it was his birthday. And again, I won't use the word, so I'll call him Crewy, but like, hey, Crewy, happy birthday, as I walk out. And he goes, oh, thanks, mate. And then the highway patrol officer, who had already been to the scene and come back, says to me, oh, his birthday too. It's my birthday, and this is the worst one. I'll never forget it in my life, I'll never forget it like this. And I was like, ooh, that's pretty, So we were suddenly, went to this new depth to prepare for, that there's going to be a lot of emotional responses on the scene. So we went down to the scene. When we get there, met by the inspector, and sort of guided through. And I'll just hold off there to, this basically was a post next day picture. And I'll just see if I can get the YouTube video going. I've failed on YouTube videos. I might let the expert in so I don't muck it up. But I'll just run a little bit of the news report. It'll just give you more information than I can on the nature of it.
See if we get it to play.
All-wheel drive rolled down an embankment and slammed into a tree. The woman, her 6-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son died at the scene, while her 3 sons, aged 1, 5 and 9, were flown to John Hunter Hospital with minor injuries.
Now, I'm very pleased to say that they have survived this tragedy. They remain in a stable condition and under observation.
To add more heartache to this story, another driver, a 37-year-old man, was coming along the same road after the crash. He ran over one of the children who'd been thrown from the car. It's unclear if that child was already deceased. Locals today are utterly devastated and say the road here is extremely dangerous.
It's very saddening thinking that a mother and her children are along the road and this has happened. It is unheard of up here.
Everybody knows about it. It's just a small community.
It's quite a long, it's about 10 minutes because there's a police response as well to it, but that probably gives you the main picture of it, which is all you need. So getting to that scene, and this is where I'll just walk through, I guess, a little bit of what I saw without too much detail, but I guess my main things, so we got there and the Westpac crew had got up just before us, so one of the children, the other 3 that were remaining, looked crook and was an obvious patient. Fortunately, did well long term, but so they were working on that child and hadn't been to the other end. And so I've got in and spoke to the paramedic and, how you guys going, anything you need, or are you happy for us to progress on? So with the forward commander, and being Central Coast, my local area, was one of those ones where everyone on scene, and sometimes it's good and bad because I like to have a chat to people, but it's not the time sometimes, and this was, and there was even a little bit more weirdness about it, I'll tell you in a minute, but we walked through the middle, and probably the thing I do recall is someone saying, just be careful where you step, because, you never know what you'll step on. That's always a bad scene, but when you got the road, you've sort of got, we're fortunate enough being there later that, 2 sheets with the children, and sort of like a bit of a tunnel through the middle, and probably if I had some vision left of it, it's about a little bit of a corridor of disaster, and then is down the other ends the other ambulance, and we've gone down there, and I saw one of the guys I worked with for some time, and how you going, and quick chat, but you sort of again just obviously you could tell everyone's quite shaken, but the next person I see is someone who's I've known that just lost their wife in recent, like in a month, and I'm like, last way I wanted to meet this person, so we sort of had that. I put his hand on his shoulder, said, how you going? And it's like, that was all I could say, but that was, but yeah, again, you're just sort of seeing your own friends sort of a bit broken walking out. It was like this slow motion seeing people, but what was inside the car was, happy in some ways that we saw 2 children, and any other accident, and it sort of was described also by, that we probably only had 2 kids restrained. So 2 were ejected, mum stayed in the vehicle, and then you got these 2 that, one sitting up on someone's lap and the other one talking away. And so I did a quick assessment. I've sort of kept back and forward through that corridor, and we sort of made a decision together that...
Sorry. If people don't mute themselves, I can mute them.
The power. So I guess it was that point that it was a really nice thing between us, I thought, that we were able to have a chat and go, we're now in a social worker type role in a way. We clicked, and you had to think about this as, who would have taken these patients and where had this been and I often think when we go to jobs, sometimes geographically we're required, sometimes critical team perspective we're required, and and sometimes there's other reasons, and this one was the other reason. That purely the only reason we took these 2 kids and they didn't roll down the hill with the crew that had them in the car comfortably was social reasons. We had, the dad was at Manila, it was a complex family unit, like one child didn't even know the other child's surname, we thought if we can get to John Hunter, we've started to connect them, and we'd have all 3 children. So the one that was still with clinical concern at the same place, we've given them the heads up. We sort of told them the way we're transporting them was more as a social unit. So we're able to keep a bigger brother and a younger one together. And so I guess going through the job, one of the really nice things was I found that as a real positive. And probably if I could comment on the way that comment on the way that we work as a crew and everybody adds a role. The older boy, which I think was 10, we're flying and we put the headset on him, purposefully, so obviously we could communicate, but also that he could listen a little bit to what was going on, be a bit distracted. And the pilot did this wonderful job. It was like he was on a commercial flight, to another country, and we had this, the weather update, such and such, we're going to be landing at smooth conditions, almost your tea and coffee's coming. And I saw a grin on this child's face that had just been through so much. And I think it was just a wonderful thing to think the person who probably had the most of the job wasn't either of us, that were probably more trained for it. So I think it's a beautiful thing about human beings, that it's not always, we can't train for everything, it's just being yourself sometimes and letting it flow, isn't it? And anyway, we got him there and there was obviously a lot ahead of it. One of the things I just wanted to finish up on, so I'll let Abs move in a moment. So I've always had this idea, and I talked, I think, a little bit on the last session about, I think everyone should have a bit of a plan. And I use this one from the fire, because I often think, okay, I know I've been to something big. I'm probably coming off a night shift most times, coincidentally it seems, and night shifts are night shifts. The next day you feel pretty, so if I'm worried about stuff, I'm like, no, it's just post night shift. And then it's that 24 hours later, I check in on myself and I go, I can't even remember what happened, to be honest. So I'm feeling good and I'm happy to move forward, and that's me. But if at that phase I'm like, I'm still thinking a lot about the job or something I did and I wasn't that happy with, I call that me watch and act phase. So, and I think I talked last time, might put a SAR watch on for 7 days, search and rescue for, that we sort of have that time where we go, when can I cut it off and say I'm good? And, usually can cancel SAR and we're all happy. But, that watch and act to me is where you just want to go, it might need a little bit of work. It might be our specialist that you want to have a chat to and it can be useful. And coincidentally, I was meant to talk to Louise, travelling home the next day, about something, around the wellbeing stuff. It wasn't about this job. And I got on the phone and I think this was a significant event stuff working well. I put it in myself, but obviously other people noticed as well. And already, she would have got a little alert. And she said, do you want to talk about that or do you want to actually talk about the job from last night? I was like, and I just started saying, no, I'm okay. Let's just carry on with what we did. And I went, actually, why don't I talk about it? I said I'd be a hypocrite not to. I'd try and help everyone else. And I don't know if people have that feeling where you don't know you're carrying some heaviness or burden until you've got rid of it. And then you go, wow, I just feel like I took some weight off my chest. And I really had that moment. And what it was because there was obviously a lot of sensory stuff in this job. And, going from the people that were there and a whole bunch of things. And normally I would stick more to my normal program and I don't really reflect on bits and pieces of the job, but I did choose on this occasion to talk through it and step through it. And it was amazing, so it's the first time I've really done that and I don't know whether I'll ever do it again, because I think the whole thing about wellbeing and support services, it's like a menu. It's who you need and what you need for that specific time in your life, And for some reason that day I thought, actually I am going to step through this and sort of just, process a little bit. And it was an amazing feeling. And really, since the job's gone really well, and I shouldn't speak for everybody, but I know with me and Abs, we checked in with each other to make sure that we're okay to do the presentation is part of the, this job isn't at the forefront of our mind or anything. So, I guess our purpose today is really to be able to chat to people and open the conversations and, make everyone feel like these things can be normal. But just to round off, a couple of things I wanted to talk about is we know that some of the times we feel really bad as if the job's gone bad, but the job wasn't necessarily something that we thought was going to be that bad. This job, was obviously out there in the yucky realm, but some of the things I thought were positive was the team, So thanks to Abs and our aviation team, that's a big part of everything, isn't it? We're all gel, we're on the same page and we all had the same purpose, and we described our purpose when it went from being, critical care to let's do what we can for the, survivors in a horrible situation. We can add little bits of something. And that's next point, I've preempted that, but basically we found a meaning for the job outside of the clinical focus. So the peer and psychological support, so just whether it was your crew, your I even, I got a call from Prime psychologist, and we kept missing each other, so I never actually got to chat. But but even knowing that people outside of our normal support people were looking out for us, but also most of all, it's your mates, everyone here, and I'm sure Ab's felt the same. That do a good job of looking out for each other. That time I talked about, so something different for me, but I thought, I felt at the end of that I didn't realise it was heavy, but it suddenly felt light, so that was good, and something I'd consider again if I felt that might have been an issue. And the ongoing check-in with the team. And I guess just finishing, I talked a little bit about my experience, but if we go into what Raelene will talk a little bit about our minds and how they work. The next morning, we're in was in the gym, and Pete was there. Sorry, I did it. I held my confidential characters all the way, but I know he wouldn't mind because and I've only given him compliments. He was the true chief on the day. I said, how you going? And he said, yeah, good. And his service has been in contact with him and that. And he goes, I just can't get out. The only thing I can't get out of my mind was the toys out of the Happy Meals on the road. And so, that was that classic. I didn't see a single toy. I didn't see stuff, but, I guess that rounds off what this whole thing's about. Someone else was holding onto an image that, was completely different when he walked up there. But, so that's it really from me. So I'll pass on to, last point was just the compounding cases. So I guess, probably two things. If I was in that surviving, not thriving mode, I was having, good period of life and, things were good overall. And I wasn't doing it on the back of multiple jobs. I think if the next week I had to go the same job, I would have had to face it a little bit differently probably and just make sure the two weren't compounding each other. So that'll do for me. I'll pass on to Abs.
Thanks, Jeff. All right. So a couple of things I just want to kind of mention from my perspective. Jeff's already kind of given you a great overview of the case and also some of his general thoughts. Just from my perspective, I want to bring up a couple of things that it's completely okay after these things to have a whole range of emotions. And certainly I've had, very different ones according to, the situation I've been in. And I think sometimes, for example, I've left traumatic cases and felt completely fine and felt like, am I human? Like, should I not be feeling, something is going on there? I felt ones where I felt absolutely terrible immediately afterwards, and I've had to actually just stop what I'm doing. I've also had ones that haven't kicked in for a few days, and I've also felt ones where I haven't really, it's not really affected me, but it's stayed with me. And, if you asked me about a case that, that affected me, I'd mention one of those cases. And, so just for example, when I was quite junior, I was involved in a pediatric resus in hospital where a child died. And after that, I just had to stop, and I locked myself in the bathroom for 5 minutes afterwards because I was just like so affected by it. I had to take 5 minutes just to completely decompress by myself because there wasn't like a formal, debrief process with this. And then equally, I've had other one, like I attended a lady who she was pregnant and essentially stabbed to death. At the time, I felt completely okay. In fact, I led a debrief with, the paramedics and police officers on scene, felt completely okay. And the next day, I saw something in the news about it, and then that just kind of set me off, and I just, suddenly hit me at that point. And there are certain points from this case, again, I was saying to my wife that it didn't really affect me at the time, but I have a feeling that at some point in the future, I don't have any kids, but I have no doubt that at some point when I do have kids, some of those memories will, may well come back and affect me. So it's quite okay to feel like, actually, I don't need to speak to anyone at all, but equally, at any stage in that process, even if it's a few years down the line, like it's just as valid to discuss some of these things. And the other really important thing is that your initial reaction doesn't necessarily predict how you're going to feel about it later. So, you can feel, terrible at first, and actually that's just part of the normal process of getting over it. And then in a couple of weeks' time, you're like, that's fine. I'm back to normal. So It's just, I guess, a little flag that kind of raises my mind that it can be important, obviously, initially to do a welfare check of people and make sure that everyone's doing okay immediately afterwards. But then in a few weeks' time to have that follow-up, because that's often where we pick up people who are still carrying these things onwards. All right. I think Jeff's already sort of discussed this quite nicely, but that idea of discussing the problem can just make such a difference. And I don't need to kind of labor this point. I think we all know that discussing these issues can be very helpful. Just to kind of one of the things I guess is useful just to think about is the difference between the pre-hospital debrief process and the hospital debrief process. I think in hospitals. I've found usually it can be quite straightforward to actually get members of the team who are involved in a resus together immediately after a resus and then discuss it. Whereas in retrieval, often people kind of have to separate out, go the different ways, and you don't often get that same sense of closure that you would. So it's important, I think, as our colleagues, and I think we are phenomenally lucky in the world that we are, that people do tend to check in just naturally. I think we have a very compassionate group of people as it is. The next day after this job, I got 2 text messages from people that are saying, "Oh, how's it all going?" And I was like, "All good, yeah, but feel completely fine." But I think that kind of one of the most important things I found for me in terms of getting over things that I think are challenging was to help the next person, and I think that's a key part of it, really. I haven't quite worked out how this fits in, there's no kind of way of making this a formal process of saying, okay, you've been through something, okay, now you're going to help the next person. It doesn't work like that. But I think anecdotally, I think it's important for us all to remember that one of the best ways to kind of to process things in your own mind is to try and help the next person along. It really helps cement things in your own head and helps you see things that they're going through that you can relate to. So again, it's just an important thing, I guess, to be aware of that that catharsis when we're going through some of these things. And ultimately, just remember that people will have different perspectives. They'll have remembered different things from this case, and it was interesting hearing the pilot's perspective of things that he took away, and again, I took away different things. Jeff took away different bits. One point I just wanted to bring to mind was when we arrived on scene, the ambulance commander mentioned to us that there were 3 deceased, and she asked us, did we want to go and assess them as well quickly? And Jeff and I did a sort of very quick kind of look at each other, and then just independently both just said no. And I think that was important for us kind of subsequent to that. And I think when you're part of the the HEMS team, the medical response, the feeling is that you have to kind of have been involved in kind of everything. And the challenge, I guess, is that sometimes you do. I think sometimes you do absolutely have to have gone and seen what's going on everywhere. And I think other times, when that they have been assessed by other professionals, and that it's not going to add to your assessment necessarily. I think all that does is it just adds additional scenes in your mind that are going to, potentially affect you or plague you, in the future. So I think it's important just to bear that in mind. Each situation is, independent, and sometimes you might, like I say, you might absolutely have to go there, but don't necessarily feel like you have to expose yourself to certain traumas if it can be avoided. Okay. And just to kind of reaffirm the point about debriefing, because we after this case, we had to get in the helicopter and fly the patients to John Hunter, so we weren't able to chat with the road crews on scene. There's when we look at some of the significant events that have happened in the past in terms of like mass casualty events, so for example, people who survived 9/11, there's a genuine concept of shared trauma that people have felt, and because they feel part of that group, that gives them some solace in the fact that I know I've got this group with me as well. That's why we have all these groups for various peoples, war veterans or overcoming an addiction. And I think it can be challenging sometimes in the pre-hospital world when we don't get to necessarily engage in the debrief process with other colleagues. I listened to a really good podcast, which I would recommend. It's on Femcast, and it was about mass casualty incident. And there was an anaesthetist called Chris Press, who talks about, he was attended the Manchester bombings that occurred a few years ago. And he said as part of his job there, he assessed several patients on scene, and then actually transported some kids to the hospital. And the last trip back to the scene, he turned up and he said, he tried to find the ambulance commander, and there was a paramedic there said, everything's complete, all finished now, debrief's already done, you can go home, good job. And then you hear him on the podcast, and he becomes really emotional. It sounds like, it's still something that kind of very hard for him to deal with. The fact that, from all this kind of amped up emotion, and then he just didn't get that chance to kind of decompress with the people who had shared that trauma with him on scene. And so again, this is something that I think I haven't quite worked out how we reconcile this, because ultimately we still have the duty of care to the patient. We still have to, take them to hospital. But I think there is something, about trying to kind of share this with other people. And again, I'll just reaffirm, we're so lucky, in the world that we are, that we have a number of people around us who are willing to kind of just step up and, check in and, and see how we're doing. We mentioned kind of some of the things that, sort of have stuck with us. Jeff, should I discuss that now, the things that stuck with me from the case here? So I think, for me, there were three things that kind of really stuck with me, and these images will be very different to anyone else. One was walking to the scene, and then I just remember seeing a baby's shoe just lying on the road, and I registered it, didn't really think about it, but it's one of those things that, again, it doesn't really upset me, but it's an image. And that's the one that I said to my wife, I imagine, when I have kids, this is something that's going to this may well affect me, just to kind of front load it nice and early on before we have our children. Another image that really stuck with me was when we were inside the ambulance, the 9-year-old boy had just been told by one of the paramedics that his older brother had died, and he got really upset, as can be understood. And then there was this beautiful moment where the paramedic just hugged him and just held him for several minutes, and I think it was great for me to see, because firstly, I don't think I've got a great understanding of how emotionally intelligent kids can be sometimes, and just kind of hearing some of the stuff he was saying, I was like, wow, this kid completely understands what's going on. And that human response from the paramedic, just to say, don't worry, I've got you, I'm here with you, and so that's I think that's one that will stick with me. And third one, apologies for bringing this up in the public forum, Jeff, was just when we were in the helicopter. We had made a decision that we were going to transport both the kids. Initially it was like, take one by road, and then Jeff and I just kind of talked to that. We were like, actually, can we just take them both? And one of them was going to sit on Jeff's lap. And it was just that, I remember that image of kind of, I was kind of looking at the 9-year-old kid who was in the stretcher. I looked across, and Jeff's there with this kid on his lap, strapped up, just kind of, again, holding this child and, looking after them, making sure they're okay, checking on them. And that was fantastic, again, for me to see. So yeah, look, I hope some of those thoughts are useful. I'm going to pass it on to Raelene now to discuss some of the more technical aspects of this.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing. I think one of the things I think is really critical is that we actually share our experience of work and how we manage and deal with it. It is tough work on some days, and I actually think that having open narratives and dialogue around how we actually manage the experience of work is really important. So thank you both. I suppose my frame is a little bit different. So I'm just going to chat more to the issues, but to actually talk a little bit about the neuropsychological aspect of our experience of work. And I think I'm hearing the stories and kind of how that fits with how we experience work. So actually, in emergency services, we respond to sort of, urgent, complex, high-risk situations all the time. What actually happens is we power up, right? So we get sympathetic nervous system activation, and actually we kind of start to actually get readied and actually primed to actually do the job that we need to do on scene. Okay, so there's actually lots of energy, a lot of adrenaline, and a lot of amygdala activation in that. Okay, that helps us do what we need to do. So actually I want to talk more about sort of how cognitive and sensory and perceptual processing happens in that space. When you've got high cognitive load, so high load where you're thinking about the incident and your focus is on response. Okay. So you get there, you're doing your job, power up and you react. I want to talk a little bit about information and memory processing, because when we talk about trauma, some of the things and the impacts that we have are related to information and memory processing post-incident. So there's two types of memory. One is unconscious, implicit memory. So that's the data, the sensations, the perceptions, the images. And I heard, like in your stories, that some of that stuff is that's everything that we're coding when we get on scene. And then we've got our conscious memory, which is our explicit memory, which actually is the meaning, the context, the sort of the self-referential kind of frame on that. It's how we make sense of things. So actually when we talk about memory, most people talk about the story, the narrative, the sort of, what it means for us. But there's a lot of unconscious processing of memory that happens on scene. So what happens when you get to a scene is you're taking in a lot of data. There's actually prioritisation of cognitive functioning. So you're actually not doing any sort of conscious memory processing. That's not what you're there for. You're there to respond and react. Okay. So what actually happens is that you actually are taking in a lot of sensory data, perceptual data, images, smells. So there's a lot of sensory kind of data coming in. So what happens when you actually get on scene and we were exposed to a sort of emergency response? So we power up, we respond, we actually code a lot of data, then we down-regulate and process. Okay, so that's sort of the trajectory that we see. So a lot of that, your focus is about being operationally and kind of, responsive and actually doing what you need to do when you're on scene. So what happens is that actually what we see post-incident is actually that trajectory happening. We're actually looking at sort of the power up and the power down, and then actually how memory changes over time. Okay, so we're getting a lot of data. So what you find is that actually as processing happens, you go from more unconscious processing or implicit memory functioning to actually explicit memory functioning in the coding. Okay. The parts of the brain that's sort of activated in this is actually sort of, the amygdala, which is actually part of your sympathetic nervous system response. But our memory is actually, and particularly our explicit memory, is our hippocampus. So that's actually, is understimulated actually when you're actually responding on scene. So actually the parts of our brain that we need to actually process aren't engaged. So what we then see is that actually we're all focused on sort of implicit memory functioning at the time of the incident. So what we then find post-incident is actually that kind of trajectory is different for everyone. So I think you mentioned some beautiful kind of examples of how that's different for everyone. That trajectory can happen sort of by the time you get to the hospital in regard to sort of that processing. It can take days, it can take weeks. Okay, so it actually depends on actually how you, lots of factors which we'll talk about in a bit, but actually it's different for everyone, okay, and what they're connected with in regard to that. So, any questions so far? I think one of the things that I think we need to be really kind to ourselves is actually just acknowledging that even if you've been in the job for many years, or even if you've been to lots of trauma, is things can be experienced as different on different occasions for lots of different factors. So actually, some of the factors that actually impact our trauma and memory functioning are things like fatigue. And I think you mentioned sort of if you get to your end of your shifts and it happens on your last shift, then actually that can feel different. I think if lots of things hit us at the same time and cumulative kind of jobs can hit us, that can actually impact as well, because you've got a lot of processing to do. You actually need to create space to be able to do that. The other thing that actually happens is if we avoid or we dissociate. So you can't process stuff if you're not attending to it. So one of the things is that we actually need to be able to tune into what we experience, and actually what we need to do is actually create space to actually process what's happened to us. And as I said, it can be quite automatic or it can take some time. And I think what happens is if you haven't had the experience where you've had a significant job or a lot of jobs hit at the same time where you've needed to do some active processing over a while, is that sometimes we can have very negative appraisals of those symptoms that come up over time. So we tell ourselves we shouldn't be feeling this way, or it shouldn't come up, or I should just get over it. And that actually can interfere with processing after the incident. The other thing I think that happens is that if there's other stress in your life that keeps your activation and your kind of emotion high, emotion disrupts processing as well. So if we've got lots of stress going on, it actually is not creating kind of the environment and the neurobiology that actually allows us to actually process the trauma. So we need actually the limbic system and the amygdala to be down-regulated for us to kind of have, you know, all the parts of the brain that actually allow us to process to be sort of engaged. So that can take some time. So typically when we're following up with staff is actually that night after is that often is really, really common for people to have a restless night, you know, because they're still down regulating, there's still a lot of processing and imagery and sensory stuff that's actually happening that's actually quite unconscious. And actually when we have a lot of sort of that unconscious sort of implicit memory, it's not integrated, processed, and it doesn't have meaning and associations and connections. So what we often get if we have like high implicit memory, which is the unconscious memory, is that we get triggers, because it's like lower level kind of processing. So cue matching triggers it off. So often people say, I heard it on the radio, or I saw it on the news, or I drove past the incident. Is that when we've got unprocessed memory, it's triggered off by cue matching at that really low level. So what happens is over time is actually as your memory becomes more integrated and processed, is that we get more active retrieval when we're trying to pull things out. And some of the sensory stuff is more processed and more integrated, so we get less triggers. Okay. Any questions? One of the things that we often talk about is then how we support people in their sort of recovery post-incident. And we've got lots of staff support options available for that. And we do psychological first aid, as Terry mentioned. What we're trying to do is create an environment and a space in which you can do that trajectory, where you're actually down-regulating and processing. Okay, so actually creating space to actually facilitate that post-incident processing is what we want to do. So the operational debriefing, I think as you mentioned, helps us start to integrate sequence, put meaning, is actually organise what we've experienced on scene. Because on scene there's not a lot of temporal kind of connections in regard to what we're coding. So it actually helps us sequence and process stuff when we start to talk about it. So debriefing, talking to peer support, follow-up by colleagues, follow-up by staff support are all actually helping us actually process and do the kind of episodic kind of processing that we need to do on our memory. As it becomes more resolved, the emotion and the kind of the vividness actually starts to fade as we do the work on the memory. Okay. If after sort of a month it's still sort of there there may be sort of sticky bits there that you need some support to do. So acute stress disorder is actually not diagnosed till a month on. So actually it can take weeks for us to create the space and to have the time to actually process things post-incident. So we're actually tracking that, we're tracking the trajectory. I do find that if people have had a lot of things, it can sometimes take longer if you don't have the space or create the space to do the processing. And often I think this is the thing, is if we haven't allowed ourselves to take good care of our kind of exposure and our sort of, to do the processing we need to do in regard to the work that we do, we have a lot of sort of undercooked memories, if you like. So that's the thing, is like when people say their bucket's full or their filing cabinet's full or things like that, is that they've got a lot of sort of unprocessed memory stuff there that we haven't done the work on. So when we do psychological intervention for trauma, it's memory work, it's processing work. What we're trying to do is actually start to kind of get people to kind of process their memories in different ways. So there's lots of best practice interventions in regard to that. All of them are trying to get people to actually process the trauma. So EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is a best practice intervention, or trauma-focused cognitive behaviour therapy. So these are sort of the two best practice interventions at the current time, but what they're trying to do is actually facilitate processing. So we want to do that early on, and a lot of that happens naturally. So most people will naturally process stuff, given that you kind of create space to do it. The other thing I suppose I wanted to actually say as well is that trauma and trauma impacts are probably only one part of how we can respond and be impacted by cumulative trauma in operational work. So, you know, we have the trauma stuff, the memory stuff, but we also have things like anxiety, depression, burnout, compassion fatigue, which are other types of impacts that we might see related to trauma. So often often people are going, it's not the jobs that I've been to, but the anticipation of me going to a job, will this be the one? You know, or it might be that kind of disconnection and numbness that we see over time, where the system's shutting down and sort of withdrawing. So there's actually lots of different kind of impacts to trauma that may not be PTSD. So I think often people sort of think that if you're exposed to a lot of trauma that you'll get PTSD. It's about 11% in emergency services and first responder organisations and in paramedicine. It's higher than the general population, but by far anxiety and depression are our most common mental health issues within an organisational setting. So we see more people around anxiety and depression than PTSD. People have good processes to actually kind of sort of resolve what they've seen. We need to create environments, and I think sort of some of the things that have been discussed, create environments to facilitate recovery and sort of down-regulation and processing of things. So I think it's about knowing how you process things as well. So often when we're supporting people, we always ask, what works for you? Some people need to talk it through. Some people actually need to kind of have that quiet space to actually do the processing. Some people journal. All those things that facilitate processing are different for different people. Some people actually, you know, have delayed reactions. So actually the processing or the triggers actually come up later. So it's quite a unique kind of area, but it's part of us actually making sense, you know, making meaning and actually integrating our experience of our job and our work. And, you know, it's actually quite a complex kind of area, if you like. I think when we work with the trauma bit of it, there's, again, lots of different impacts. There's the emotional dysregulation. So if the emotion associated with the incident is not down-regulating, it actually stops you from processing it. In two ways. You either get hypo arousal or hyper arousal. So too high, too low. It's like stress, right? We don't like the tails, okay? So we actually need a sweet spot where we're actually in that zone where we can do the processing. So sometimes when we're working with people, it's actually to sort of regulate emotions so that people can actually the processing sort of kicks off. Sometimes it's about the avoidance and the dissociation, so people are disconnecting from their experience. So again, you actually can't process if you're not connected with it. And then sometimes it's about the thinking bit of it, the cognitive bit of it. So that might be around the meaning and the context. That might be about how it impacts yourself or worldview. It might be around moral injury. Okay, so there's actually different aspects then of the meaning and the context and the kind of how we integrate the experience for ourselves. So I suppose I want to say that because there's lots of different ways that it can get a bit stuck. And it's just about understanding the process of actually the experience of our work, how we experience it, how we take in data, and actually then how we process it, resolve it, integrate it, and put it away. Okay. And there's lots of ways that we can do that. And there's lots of ways that, you know, just because of timing, when it happens, the sort of sometimes the detail of the event. So some events are just bigger. They need more work. Okay. Or there's some that are more personally relevant to us as well. So often I think there's personal things about, you know, obviously, you know, if we've got children or sort of there's a connection or a likeness to something in our life that can feel more significant for us. It's around meaning and context. But I suppose it's about actually just knowing how you're being impacted, creating space to process it. And if it gets sticky, it's very technical psychology work, sticky. But if it gets a bit stuck, you might need some support to work out at what point or where in that trajectory it's actually stuck and how we kind of facilitate processing. We do this all the time. You do it every day, okay? But some trajectories get a little bit stuck, okay? That's a sort of a very brief overview. I suppose a couple of things is that everyone's different, takes different time. It might take different time this week that, you know, than sort of 3 years ago. You just got to actually be kind to yourself and actually let yourself kind of do what you need. Okay. The other thing I think that Ab's picked up is exposure. We don't expose ourselves to things that we don't need to see. And I think we're getting much better about that. I think sort of historically there was a lot of kind of cultural issues about you get on scene and you kind of, you know, have a look at it all and get used to it. We don't desensitise trauma, and particularly passive roles. So actually, if you have a passive role on scene, it's increased exposure, and sort of unless you have an active role, you shouldn't be looking. You know, you shouldn't be there. Okay, so I think over the 3.5 years that I've been here, I'm hearing more kind of comments about people being held off, people not being actually exposed to stuff, and actually people being really aware of not exposing people that don't need to see, which is so great, right? We don't need to put more stuff in our memory bank that we need to do work and actually sort of to process. Okay. I think that's sort of a bit of a general summary. I thought it was just important for us to know kind of what we go through and how it looks from a neuropsychological point of view, and that everyone experiences it differently. And I think also about our support is actually support's different for everyone, and actually what people need. Often people will say to me, I know I just need to get through my shifts and I have a few days off and I do X, Y, and Z and then I'll be good. So that actually, over years, I think you actually learn what works for you and what helps you process. And I think Terry's point about the check-in points, about, you know, where are you up to in the process and actually what do you need and what's going to help. And sometimes it does feel different, okay, for lots of different reasons or factors, and that's okay. Different doesn't mean that it's not going to sort of resolve. It just means that for different reasons, this may actually have been experienced differently. Okay. Any questions or observations or reflections, I suppose, for the three of us, actually, Abs or Terry? Any?
I haven't had anything on the WhatsApp.
Oh. Terry always takes it.
Anybody have any questions? You can pass the microphone around.
No.
So I suppose just on the significant events register, because it's been mentioned a couple of times, what we are often looking at is the potentiality of things. So I think one of the things we need to remember is actually when we're putting things on, it's at the point of the incident. We don't know how we're going to respond or react to an incident. So actually, if we think it's been a big job or there's a few factors, we should actually just create an environment where if people need to, they can actually sort of access support. So it's often why we mobilise support, and you'll get calls or texts or from people. It's creating an opportunity if you need to kind of talk or to process it, because in those days after, what we're trying to do is actually get that down regulation of emotion and get the sort of processing moving from sort of unconscious to conscious processing, get meaning happening, associations, integration, and actually to resolve the experience for you, so that sort of it resolves. And that's about, people are resilient, people learn. I think that sort of we're talking more about post-traumatic growth and actually how experience of difficult and challenging incidents actually, we process them and we learn about ourselves, we learn about others, and we get useful insights. But it doesn't mean we're not going to be impacted in some way or we're going to have to not do work on it. That's all part of actually experiencing sort of difficult stuff. And about being resilient is not about not having difficult stuff, but how we manage it. Yeah. Any questions?
Well, thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you very much.